All right, we're going to think about the West being won for Christ, at least in part. And one example of that, who illustrates about five things at the same time, is Sheldon Jackson, who was a Presbyterian minister, and he was assigned different duties by his denomination. Um, he was very resourceful. We would say he thought outside of the box. There is a college named for him in Alaska, which Sheldon Jackson College, which operated continuously for a long time. But before he became famous in Alaska and actually ended up with a government assignment and became responsible for about 1/3 of the caribou that Alaska now has, or reindeer. If you put reins on them, they're reindeer. If you don't, they're caribou. Same animal. But Sheldon Jackson was serving the Lord, exemplifying the Great Commission in action in Oklahoma, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, what was then called Dakota before it was split in North and South, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. He started out, or at least we'll pick up with this part of his very colorful life, in 1858 as a Presbyterian missionary in Oklahoma to the Choctaw. And at that time, Oklahoma was split up in the different Indian jurisdictions, depending on what their tribe was. A lot of changes were happening in what we now call America as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And that added more than 500,000 square miles to the nation of America, including parts of Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. And there were some other lands that Mexico had quit-claimed that were part of Texas, which of course would eventually join the Union. So Sheldon Jackson wanted to plant churches and Christian schools in the West to promote Christianity from a Presbyterian perspective. How do you go about doing that? What is an efficient way to use the technology that existed then to plant churches in the Wild West? Not that he hadn't done church planting before, because while he was a pastor, among other things, in Minnesota for 10 years and Wisconsin and Iowa, he was involved in 23 churches, which radiated hundreds of miles from the base that was on the Mississippi River. As you can see, the Mississippi River goes all the way up to Minnesota, and it acts as the border, the boundary between Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then you have on the western side Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and on the eastern side of the river you have Wisconsin and Illinois, and then it joins up with what looks like the Ohio River, and then it continues to flow south. Here was Jackson's idea: the railroad. The railroad connected the east of the United States to the west. And the infrastructure for the railroad was already there. So you had a means of efficient travel, and you had all these different little locations along the path of the railroad. And so his thought was, every place where the trains stop, we need a church. And so the thing to do is get on the train and get off at the next stop and then start a church there. And once you've done that, get back on the next train and go to the next stop and get off at the next stop and start a church there. That was his approach. And God blessed that approach, and God arranged it so that he got a free pass for the railroad. Now think of how useful that is. I mean, it'd be like if you had a free pass that let you ride any airplane that you wanted to. And didn't have to go through security. Anyway, so he was given this very important credential that allowed him to ride the rails of the Union Pacific Railroad. And so that was his goal. Every single place where the train stops, I'm going to get off, and I'm going to go to what looks like the center of town, and I'm going to start preaching on the corner of the major intersection. And I'm going to preach, and I'll attract a crowd. And eventually, after they've listened for a while, those who appear to be respectful, I'm going to tell them afterwards, those of you who want to start a church, when I'm finished, you stay with me, and we'll have a meeting, and we'll have a planning meeting, and we'll start a church. And that was his approach. And he did that. As you can see, all along this railroad, you'll see examples of that. So he did that in Wyoming, and he did that in these other states. So if you look on the map here, you see all these different stops that the railway had, and he endeavored to start a church at every one of those stops where you see the little red symbol there. He also went into Montana, and of course a lot of the folks that he dealt with were on the rough side. Many of them were seeking gold, and one of the places he went to was we went to Colorado, and there are church buildings that are standing to this day that were from congregations that he assembled. And he might have started a church with 4 people, and then he would check up with them from time to time, similar to how, the Apostle Paul would always keep track of the different churches that he started. He would check up on them to see how they were doing, and then he would also do fundraising through the Presbyterian denomination that he belonged to. Some of the gold miners in Denver, Colorado, and saloon keepers would sing hymns. He would provide them with music to sing. And here's a place that you've probably heard of, Colorado Springs. That was actually established by Dr. Jackson in 1872. He also established churches in Denver and Pueblo and Colorado City and Golden City. Sometimes they would meet in railroad coach cars, and then they would establish a church. If there was a military fort nearby, he would always try to take advantage of that. But he had an eye out for where can we establish a church. He was not afraid to go into Mormon territory and try to establish a Presbyterian church there. Right? Salt Lake City. He decided we've got to have a Presbyterian church there in Salt Lake City. Do you think that he was welcomed? Not exactly, but that didn't stop him. This is what the Utah History Encyclopedia says in their article about Sheldon Jackson's involvement in the state of Utah. I'll just read a little bit about it. These new Presbyterian congregations were a result of the expansive vision, sturdy faith, and seemingly inexhaustible energy of Dr. Sheldon Jackson, Superintendent of Missions for Iowa, Nebraska, Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. He was appointed to that position less than a month before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. That was God's timing. Just like when the printing press was invented, very soon after that, you see Martin Luther go into action and the Protestant Reformation really kick off. So here you have the technology of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Jackson was a man of action, and in his first year of work, he traveled 22,690 miles by railroad, stagecoach, horseback, and on foot, and Presbyterian congregations were established in many parts of the American West. The education strategy of the Presbyterians was being simultaneously implemented in Salt Lake City, and here's why. They established a school. It opened with 63 pupils. The Presbyterian Church denominational politics, which he fought continuously, hindered the development of schools, but eventually he was able to petition the General Assembly for a policy change, and as a result, more funding and also allowing single female missionaries were allowed, and they were routinely very helpful in establishing Christian schools. And so the gatekeeping problem had to be resolved, and Jackson eventually got his way on that. So he continued to establish churches and missions and Christian schools in New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Texas during the 1880s. And then he was assigned to Alaska. And there's so much involved in that I'll just skip it so that I don't get too involved in the details of that. But he established schools there, and one of the things, I will mention this, one of the things he noticed with the natives of Alaska was that when there was a bad year food-wise, many of them starved to death. And so he thought if they had a dependable source of meat, and this isn't the coastal parts of Alaska where the fishing was very prevalent. This was more farther inland, and so he thought if they could have caribou herds that they could have as a stable source of meat, that would be good. So he arranged with his friends, including friends in the government who had revenue cutter boats, early version of our Coast Guard, that would actually make it over to Russia. He arranged to purchase herds of caribou from Russia, take them across the Bering Sea area, get them to Alaska, and then he would go visit a specific village of Alaskan natives and say, I am going to lend you a herd of caribou, and I know how many I'm giving you, and I'm going to come back at any time I want to, and I'm not going to tell you when I'm coming back. So I'll surprise you. I'll be the mystery shopper. And when I come back, I'm going to count females. And if you are shy one female, I repo the whole herd and I give them to some other village. Because the females are the ones who are bearing the next generation of caribou. So you can harvest, that is, you can kill and eat the males, but you've got to keep at least as many females as what I entrusted you with. And I will be checking in on you from time to time, or I might send somebody as my representative. He did that to many different communities. As a result, they weren't tempted to get greedy and just kill off a whole lot of them. It forced them to use self-control in maintaining their herd. And it's been estimated that 1/3 to 1/4 of the caribou in Alaska today trace back to those that Sheldon Jackson brought over from Russia. And it resulted in a lot of natives not starving when they would have. Okay, we move on to the Wendish Lutherans who went west. The largest group of Wendish Lutherans came to Texas in the 1800s, and they have a community that still to this day preserves their heritage to a large degree. Wendish is a Slavic language, and so these people were linguistically Slavs, but they were not Catholics. They were Lutherans. And the land that they came from today is now, part of that land is in Germany and part of that land is in Poland. And we will skip the details of how they came here and why they came here, but they came here and established their own communities. Some of them have kind of blended in. Because of where they came from, they typically knew German in addition to their Wendish language. Here is the church that they maintain to this day in the hill country where they are. And this is a Wendish Lutheran church. Sherry and I have been there more than once. And originally they would carry on bilingual worship services. So one worship service is in Wendish and the other was in German. And then eventually they got to where they started having an English service, and now they only have Wendish once a year, I think. And they still have some German, but I don't know the details on that. So this is their museum.
Go back to that and
Okay.
show where the pastor stands.
Oh, as in some Lutheran, very formal Lutheran churches, the pastor is in that like little miniature balcony, that white box right here.
Halfway to heaven.
And now there's seating up here for congregants as well as down here in the pews. And if you're up here, and let's say it's a 6-year-old boy who has a baseball hat on, an usher will come up there and tap him with a rod and say, "Take your hat off." It's a very reverent community, and every year they have a specific sermon on John 3:16. Okay, now we move on to the Norwegians who came to the West, and the one who gets the most credit, and probably deservedly so, was Kling Pearson. He was the leader of Norwegian immigration to America in general and to Texas in particular. In fact, there's a Kling Pearson Highway in Bosque County, and this is the farm where he lived when he got to Texas. But many of the immigrants that he brought to America from Norway were Haugian Lutherans. These were pietistic, that is, they were very evangelistic. They had home Bible studies. They would sing hymns in their homes, and often they were persecuted because many of the more formal state, that is government-run church hierarchy, did not approve of unlicensed Bible studies and unlicensed prayer meetings and things like that. So many of the Haugian Lutherans decided, we want more religious freedom, let's go to America. And Kling Pearson led many of them to America. So this is his farm in Texas, a place you can go to. You see this Norwegian stamp, postage stamp. It says right here, Kling Pearson. And they spell his name more than one way, which is not surprising. In 1848, Kling Pearson came from Illinois and stayed with us 2 or 3 weeks, and then went to 4 Mile Prairie, where John Reinert Ryerson had settled. Pearson stayed in Texas a while, then returned to Illinois, and came again to Texas in 1850, bringing along a whole bundle of Bibles and New Testaments. I bought a copy of each, and then he goes on to talk about what it was like in Dallas County, and some of the readings that they did, and then talking about how some people were not trusting the Bible because they were trusting the humanism of Voltaire, but that these Norwegians who settled in Bosque County, that they weren't impressed with Voltaire. One of the concerns that they had was they didn't have a pastor. We were without a minister while I was in Texas. We negotiated with the Reverend Stubb about securing a Norwegian Lutheran minister from the north, but nothing came of it. People would usually gather on Sundays, and some person would then read a sermon from a devotional book for our edification. The first Lutheran service was conducted in this house that you see in the top left, called the Ringnes House. It's been restored. It's been moved from its original relocation and then reassembled. And in fact, this artwork right here, Rose Mulling, was done by Mimi Fossum, who was the painting instructor for Sherry and me some time ago. She also was a spy during World War II in Norway against the Nazis. This is the Ringnes House, where the first Norwegian Lutheran service was held in Bosque County, Texas. The cemetery there will show you many of these very brave settlers who came, and they came not just for opportunity and for land, but also they wanted religious freedom, and they wanted to practice their Lutheran faith as they thought proper. If we go farther west, we could talk about Snowshoe Thompson, who delivered the U.S. mail on skis. And the common theme here is all of this movement filling the earth, and for those who had the Christian faith, they took the Christian faith with them, and they were basically doing their part to match Acts 1:8, being a witness for the Lord unto the uttermost part of the earth where God directed them to go. We've already talked about Sheldon Jackson. Here is the college that was founded for him. There were 3 lucky Swedes who struck it rich in the gold rush of Alaska. Now they're called Swedes, but at that time Sweden owned Norway. So if one of them is actually a Norwegian, he's still going to be called a Swede at that time because of that. So here they are, and one of them took his fortune and funded missionary work and funded also, what do you call that place in Houston?
You mean the church?
Yeah. It's basically a church in a port city that is designed specifically for sailors. So if you have a major city like, say, San Francisco, which is a port, and ships are coming in and offloading whatever, and people are getting on and off the boats, and of course sailors are going to be in town for a little while. They didn't want the sailors to just carouse and get drunk and cause trouble and things like that. They wanted to have a mission just for the sailors, just for the seamen. That's the word I was looking for, Seamenskirken. They wanted to have a church that was designed just for seamen who are going to be in town for a little while because their ship was docked in town. And so one of these struck-it-rich gold miners decided that he would commit what today would be millions and millions of dollars to establishing missions to serve the spiritual needs of seamen who would be in town because their ship had docked. Nome, Alaska was where they made their fortune. One side note to that is that one of their friends was Leonard Seppala, who was the most critical member of the sled dog racing that took place to get the serum to Nome when they had the diphtheria epidemic. They weren't able to take planes, they weren't able to take ground transportation, they weren't able to get ships there. The only way they could get that medicine to Nome when they were experiencing their epidemic was by dog sleds. And so they would give one dog musher the vial, and he'd put it in a careful place, and then he would take his team of dogs and they would go through the blizzards if necessary until he got to a certain place where he'd stop, and then someone else would take over and would take it farther and stuff like that. And that's an amazing adventure in itself. But we move on to another part of Oklahoma, and in this case we have let's talk about small world. The person who you see in the top middle is Pastor Bob Crowley. His father was Pastor Dale Crowley, and they are descended from Mayflower Pilgrims, specifically John Alden and his wife Priscilla. So direct descendants of the Mayflower Pilgrims, who we talked about yesterday, would include the Crowleys. And the Crowleys had a very colorful history. They got involved in opposing evolution being taught at Baylor University in the early 20th century. They had church feuds. You've probably seen a church feud before, but not like what they had. Because Pastor Dale Crowley one time was resisting a startup cult that was trying to take over his church. And as it turned out, he got the law involved. They ended up with a lawsuit. There was a lot of hot temper and hot blood. And one particular day, he was in his study inside his church, and there was a man with him who who he called the German, because I guess the guy was ethnically German and also spoke German, who had a cane. And he was getting ready to turn a corner, and he realized that there was a gunman at the end of the hall aiming at him. And the German man took his cane and kind of pushed him like that to get out of the line of fire. What he didn't know was there was another assassin at the other end of the hall who was also aiming, so that when he came into the hallway, he was going to be shot from two directions. But he jumped back, or was pulled back fast enough that the one assassin killed the other assassin. Now this is a church feud. Anyway, where one of the would-be assassins ends up killing the other one. Dale Crowley eventually made it to the DC area and started a radio gospel program, as well as being a church pastor. And to make ends meet, he also, during part of that time, somehow became involved in leasing rental apartments to renters. And then when he learned that one renter was using his space in the dwelling for sinful activities with other men. All right, we're talking Sodom and Gomorrah. And so Pastor Dale Crowley basically beat him up and threw him out, and after a whole lot of bloodshed, told somebody on the street, somebody needs to get a physician here to deal with that guy. But anyway, very colorful, very sparky lifestyle. And then his firstborn son carried on his radio ministry after him, and then the second-born son became the founder of a Baptist church in the Rockville area, and also two Christian camp, resort type camps or summer camps for children kind of thing. And he was my pastor for a while. So it's a small world, direct descendants of Mayflower Pilgrims. Well, the Great Commission expects us to be going. We're in the process of going different places, and we're in the process of teaching what we know to others so that they can observe whatever Christ has commanded us. And we're making disciples. We're training people. We're using our family history to glorify God and to remind our family members of how God has acted in the past, to give them the lives that they have, and also to give them the truth that they have. And we could go through many, many examples. But when you study family history, you can better appreciate the Bible. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and that means not just leaving money to your grandkids, but something which is much more valuable than money. And helping the children to understand what kind of history went before them. In Joshua 4:6, the stones were used as a memorial to trigger people's memory so that the next generation could say, what are these stones all about? And then the older generation can say, let me tell you how God acted on our behalf and blessed us, and these stones are to help us to remember that. So we use teachable moments with children, and we pass on what we know. Family history often takes place with political crises. Remember when there was an attempt to kill Paul when he was going to be escorted by the Romans from one place to another, based on the trial that he was to have for the accusations made against him? It was a family member who learned of this plot and who went and told the Roman official, and as a result, the plot was foiled. We see family history in 2 Timothy, where Paul is referring to Timothy's mother, Eunice, and his grandmother, Lois, and how, as a result of their faith, they were taught the Holy Scriptures. And it's that faith that provides us with what we need to know to have salvation in Christ Jesus. So, who are your kinfolk? Who is near enough that you can visit with them, and who is far away enough that you're going to have to use telecommunications to stay in touch with them. And don't limit your family history research to those who are biologically related to you, but adoptions count, relationships by marriage, that is in-laws count, step kin count, and we realize that we ourselves are adopted as children by Christ to himself. And so, we don't limit our appreciation for what God does in family history to those who are our blood kin. And documenting family history is a good way to do this. Special events, special vacation trips, whatever, they can be used for sharing the unique history, the unique ways in which God has blessed your life, my life, our families, so that others within our family know that. Here's an example of a Viking king who did that in a very succinct way. But if you go to Denmark, if you go to a certain place in Denmark, you will see 2 inscription stones. And what symbol is this? Bluetooth. That's the guy who had this inscribed. His name was Harold Bluetooth, and Bluetooth Technologies is actually named after him. And the reason why is because Harold Bluetooth became the first Christian king of Denmark, and he changed it in a huge way. And so Denmark was never the same. And so when the Bluetooth technology got started, they thought, well, we're going to be just as revolutionary as King Harold Bluetooth, so we're going to call our technology Bluetooth. Well, Harold Bluetooth did 2 things that he memorialized here. One was he was proud of his wife. King Gorm made this monument in memory of Thurve, his wife, Denmark's adornment. And so that was a part of the family history in which you see the family relationship is honored. And then the other inscription says, King Harold ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thurve, his mother, that Harold, who won for himself all of Denmark in Norway and made the Danes Christian. And of course he would have included Norway in that because Norway was considered a possession of Denmark at that point. So the point was he promoted Christianity to his kingdom, which included then Denmark and the possession of Norway. So that goes back 1,000 years. So those rocks are still there if you go to the place in Denmark that has them. Important events can be used to document God working in our lives. And when you think about it, the idea of living epistles, which we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, is illustrated in the Old Testament in Daniel chapter 5. Because when the handwriting on the wall happens and Daniel confronts Belshazzar, what does he fault Belshazzar for failing? He doesn't say, King Belshazzar, you knew the scriptures. You're not obeying the Bible. No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, King Belshazzar, you have resisted the testimony of God that he's provided through the witness of creation. No, what he does is he points to the family history. And the interesting thing is, the family history is not perfect. The Bible is perfect. It's authoritative. It's inerrant. It's just absolutely perfect in every way. But what Belshazzar is faulted for is for failing to take seriously the truth, the witness of God, that was available to him by knowing, by seeing, by learning how God acted in Belshazzar's family. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was not inerrant. He was not authoritative, epistemologically speaking. But God provided enough serious truth through working through the life of Nebuchadnezzar which we see summarized in chapter 4 of Daniel, that Belshazzar was found accountable for what should he have learned from God working in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. And even though Nebuchadnezzar is not an inerrant witness by any means of God's truth, there was enough truth there to hold Belshazzar accountable. And so this is how Daniel confronts him. He reminds him of the family history and how God worked in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. But when his heart, referring to Nebuchadnezzar, who is the grandfather of Belshazzar, was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he, that is God, appointed over it whomsoever he will. And you, his son, which literally would mean direct male descendant, so it would include a grandson. You, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways, you have not glorified. Daniel was faulting Belshazzar for failing to glorify God with the truth that was available to him, that was presented to him through his family history. And Paul refers to this same concept in 2 Corinthians 3 when he says, "You are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart." So Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, you're not the Bible. The Bible's perfect. But you're supposed to be a paraphrase. Try to be the best paraphrase you can be. Because you're not going to, no paraphrase is equal to the Bible itself. But that's not an excuse for the paraphrase to be sloppy. And so that's our responsibility, is to be walking paraphrases, living epistles that are read by other humans around us. And Belshazzar was supposed to read God's work and God's message and God's truth as shown in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. He should have read that and taken it seriously, and Daniel said, you failed. You didn't. So the people, as imperfect as our lives are, God is still holding people accountable for what they can learn of Him in our lives. And that means that's a heavy responsibility on us. So we need to rely on the indwelling Holy Spirit to guide us in taking that responsibility seriously and being faithful about it. But those who see our lives and are impacted by us, God is not letting them off the hook by saying, well, you know, that person was an imperfect witness, so I'll let it slide. Nope. God is holding them accountable for the truth that is available to them. Okay. Kind of wrapping up some of these concepts before we move on to some other aspects of the Great Commission. Near misses. We talked about that yesterday. Let's think about that again for a little while. And that is, God was protecting every one of us in many different ways, both during our lifetime, but even before our life, if you're looking at Earth history. So God knew the future. That's way over our heads. But at the same time, we should take seriously that God was acting to protect us and to bless us at many times before we were even born, by the way that He cared for people who would make a difference in our lives, either by being our ancestors or by giving us the gospel or by training us in the Christian faith, something like that. And remember from yesterday, you could have been a grackle. I could have been a grackle. If God made me a grackle, wouldn't be a thing I could do to resist that. So be thankful for who God made you and realize He didn't have to make you who you are. And so we need God to create us. We need Him to save us from our sin. So we need a creator. We need a savior. Christ is both. And we need God to give us the truth. And He has, through His Holy Spirit, given us the scriptures. and as a result, we need to be thankful. So, why don't we go ahead and take our next 7-minute break now, and that'll give me a chance to pull up the next series of PowerPoint slides.